Hardcore Skeptic.
Hey folks, welcome to the Hardcore Skeptic Examines, a podcast that takes a very long look at a particular subject through a series of interviews and commentary. This is the 15th episode in the first season of this show, and the subject at hand is social justice. Before I get started, I want to say how sorry I am that I haven't done this series as fast as I thought I would. Sometimes it really seems like I have all the time in the world, so I get a few things done, and then it just switches and it's the opposite, and it gets like the last 3 months where I haven't done anything. It's coming up on a year since I started this project, and I still have a bunch of interviews to get out. I made a decision regarding the anti-side of things, though. I'm not going to pretend to give them a fair shake anymore. If they say something ignorant or wrong, then I'm going to point it out, and I no longer care if they get pissed. I noticed that someone did an attempted takedown video of my interview with Christy Winters, and nobody gave me a chance to have that discussion and rebut claims. The anti-social justice crowd is wrong about all the things, and I'm growing very tired of humoring them. So with that said, this isn't an anti. This is an interview with Danielle Muscato, one of the great superstars of the atheist SJW activist circles. She's the host of the Resist podcast and has been a speaker and debater and activist for years in atheism. She's been one of the voices that I've been following for a long time, and I've learned a lot from. I really wish that I had gotten this interview out earlier because Danielle is such a busy person that she's done a ton of stuff since we talked. I'll link to as many things as I can in the show notes, but I really suggest following her on Twitter and Facebook and following her page and just listening to the Resist podcast. It's been a couple months now since they had an episode as well, but it's valuable information and it's timeless in a sense. I'm not sure what else there is to say, so I guess here it is. My interview with Danielle Muscato. So I'll get you, maybe for people who don't know you, maybe if you can introduce yourself and give us a bit of your background.
Sure. My name is Danielle Muscato. I'm a civil rights activist in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm an atheist. I'm a transgender woman. I am a social justice warrior, as they're called. I used to work for American Atheists as their public relations director. I now just do, I guess you could call it freelance public speaking and organizing rallies and other types of events. And writing columns and things like that. All sorts of different types of things, traveling around to universities and conferences and so on, giving talks, and getting people organized to fight back against fascism.
That's awesome. So in your view, what is social justice?
Well, social justice is really just activism that is focused on making things more equitable for people, fighting against things like discrimination, fighting against things like racism and sexism and misogyny and transphobia and transmisogyny and really everything that makes life difficult for oppressed people. Social justice really at its core revolves around the principle of privilege. And I think privilege is something that a lot of people misunderstand and don't really understand why it's a bad thing or what it means to be privileged. So just to put this in a little bit of context here, privilege are the unearned advantages that somebody has in their life. And it's nothing to be ashamed of, and it's nothing to be guilty about necessarily. It's just a fact about reality that if you're born white in America and you're a U.S. citizen by birth, and your parents have some money, none of those things were things that you chose or that have any bearing on your how you act as far as your personality and things that you decide to do. But they do give you very concrete advantages in the real world as far as job opportunities, as far as, what happens if you get arrested, the way the justice system treats you, and all sorts of other advantages. And basically, the idea behind social justice activism is not to make things worse for white people, rich people, etc. it is to make sure that the advantages that that white people enjoy, that rich people enjoy, that cis people enjoy, that straight people enjoy, and so on, aren't oppressing and hurting other people. So we want fairness, we want justice, we want no discrimination, we want things that are harming other people not to cause that harm. It's really just about lessening suffering as much as we can.
It seems like a laudable goal.
I think so. That's why I've dedicated my career to it. Yeah.
Right. So I guess that kind of speaks to how these different grassroots organizations like Black Lives Matter and feminist organizations fit into social justice. Or is that kind of the gist of it? They're just different groups trying to get privilege or kind of balance the scales?
Well, yeah, and it's not even necessarily about balancing the scales, although I understand what you're getting at with that. But like, there is a lot of intersectionality and working together with these different groups. I'm just to clarify, for people who can't see this or who don't know me, I'm a white person, but Black Lives Matter is probably the cause that I'm most passionate about. Like if you go to my Twitter page, it's just at Danielle Muscato. My profile picture is me wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt. And that's if I could be known for like one thing, like the last couple of years, it would be Black Lives Matter activism.
Right.
But you don't have to be part of a group to be an ally for that group. Although you definitely don't want to, speak over people who are in that group, and you want to use your privilege to elevate the voices of oppressed people who are in that group. And that's what I try to do. But yeah, I think it's important to understand about privilege also that, I didn't say this in the last question, but, having privilege doesn't guarantee that you'll be successful or happy or wealthy or anything like that.
Right.
It just means that you're not going to be discriminated against or oppressed because of that thing. So it's like, the way I've seen it put is like, being white doesn't mean that you're rich or whatever, but but you'll never be poor because you're white. That's not how that works.
Right.
And I would say the moral obligation of every person who has privilege to use it to try to make the world a better place for people who don't. And different people have different kinds of privileges. Like, for example, I'm a transgender woman, so I don't have privilege as far as living in a cisgender world, but I am white also, and I have white privilege. So it can go different directions depending on what you're talking about.
Right. I wonder, quite often when we discuss privilege, people get hung up on this. Well, my life was hard. I had these troubles. What do you think is the best way to speak to that?
No, I'm not arguing that your life can't be hard. If anybody's life can be hard, but I would say that having a tough life is a relative thing, and whatever privileges you have, there are others that you don't have, and whatever disadvantages you have because of the circumstances of your life, there are other circumstances that could make it worse. And so basically, just privilege is just the concept of recognizing that you have certain advantages, not that you're, that everything is fine, not that your life is great or even good, but just recognizing that you have certain advantages that other people don't have.
Right.
And like I was talking to Janet Mock recently. She's a transgender activist who came to SLU, St. Louis University here last week. And she talked about the difference between passing privilege and being pretty. And so Janet, as a transgender woman herself, she has passing privilege, and she's also really gorgeous. But she looks just like a cis woman. Like you would never ever guess that she is transgender. And she didn't tell anybody for many years that she was, when she moved to New York to become a journalist and started doing it. So she has passing privilege, which is one kind of privilege. She also has, separately from that, privilege as somebody who's really pretty and good looking, and it's helped her a lot in her journalism career, being a TV host and so on.
Right.
But like, there are plenty of trans people who are really good looking, but they don't necessarily pass as cis. And just the other way around too, there are trans people who pass, but they're not pretty. Like, and passing just means that other people who see you on the street correctly identify you as the gender that you want, that you are inside. Right. So, but that's all that means. Like, it doesn't mean you are attractive. So, that's a whole separate thing. So like I was saying, I mean, it just depends on, if one of your goals, just as an example, for transitioning is to be comfortable enough in your body so that you can start dating, and then you are able to pass, so that people of the sexual orientation that you're interested in read you the way that you want them to, as far as your gender identity. That doesn't necessarily mean anyone's going to be attracted to you unless you also are attracted, or unless you also appear in a way that's attractive to them. So that's one. Anyway, but my point is, like we were talking earlier about what privilege is. One of the things that Janet Mock talks about is, she says, as an activist who is pretty and trans, people who are upset about trans people or dislike trans people or afraid of trans people are more willing to listen to me because I look good. Right. Because, I fit their picture of someone who's not scary and not a freak, who's right. She looks like a gorgeous TV host. Right. And when she talks about trans issues, to that type of cisgender person, they're just much more willing to listen versus somebody like me who just started estrogen 3 weeks ago and nobody would read me as anything other than a man when I walk outside because of, that's just how I look still. So when I talk about the struggles that trans women face, people are like, what? What are you talking about? Just because of my appearance. But that's different struggles for different people. Right. Nobody's judging anybody else for having an easier time in life. We understand that everybody has certain struggles, but have some perspective and use your privilege to help people less privileged than you. Right.
There's kind of this idea that when we talk about different levels of privilege, or we talk about different types of groups being oppressed, that there's like Dave Rubin likes to talk about the oppression Olympics. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could speak to that to some degree.
Sure. Yeah, of course. So oppression Olympics is this kind of idiom for when one person talks about, like, I have a really hard life because I'm black and I have a disability and, I never went to college and somebody else is like, well, that may be, but I'm transgender and I'm, First Nation and I have a mental illness and and it's like arguing about who has it worse. And I think there's a place for everybody at the table, even, rich, white, cis, straight people. But you have to understand your place at the table as someone with a lot of privilege is mostly going to be listening. Right. And frankly, it's mostly going to be supporting other people. And by supporting, I mean, let's just talk about the wage gap and unemployment gap as one example of this. Sure. So it's extremely difficult to make as much money as a white, straight, cis person with a rich family with lots of network connections who can, pay for you to go to college and so on, compared to, a person of color whose parents didn't go to college, whose parents can't afford to send them to the best schools without huge loans, who's maybe, trans or gay or something like that. Those types of things just make it harder to get hired, make it harder to keep jobs. And it's just, your earning potential is, in theory, going to be the same, but in practice, because of biases and because of just systemic issues, it really doesn't end up being that way. There is a wage gap.
Right.
A huge number of trans people are unemployed. I think it's like 4 or 5 times the national average. And a lot of trans people end up doing sex work because there's a market for it, and it's one of the only ways that we can pay our bills. And it's not necessarily something that we necessarily would want to do if we had other ways to do it.
Right.
But if there's no law that protects you from getting fired if your boss finds out that you're trans, and if you don't pass well enough to go get a regular job, you don't have a whole lot of other choices to keep a roof over your head, especially if, depending on where you live, there might not be certain types of protections for trans people at homeless shelters and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And we talk about what's called survival sex, which is basically, exchanging a place to sleep for the night and dinner for sex with somebody. And,
Okay.
It's all over Craigslist, men looking for that, mostly men. And if you're a trans woman and it's cold outside or hot outside and you're afraid of being mugged or raped or something, if you sleep outside, that's what you're going to do if you have no other option. Anyway, but we were talking about Oppression Olympics and and what that means. And what I wanted to say is when we're talking about this wage gap, when we're talking about the reality of how difficult it is to support yourself for the people who have the least privilege, and I was just giving one example.
Right.
The rich, white, cis, straight people, it's important for you to recognize that you have advantages that you didn't earn. I'm not saying you need to apologize for that, but it's just a fact. And, not that you necessarily have a ton of money to give away, but you should recognize that one of the advantages of those privileges is that you probably earn more money.
Right.
And so when we talk about, who is supporting all these different nonprofits, who is supporting all these different on the ground activists through their Patreon accounts or whatever, one of the things that allies should be doing is helping with money. And another thing that allies should be doing is helping spread the word. And for the same reason I was talking about earlier with Janet Mock, people who are white are more willing to listen to other people who are white.
Yeah.
But I'm not necessarily saying that white people should speak over people of color. I'm saying that white people should say to their white friends, hey, you should read this book by this person of color because this is talking about stuff that is outside of our experience, but is really important to know.
Right.
And I think as far as the Oppression Olympics thing, everybody has struggles, and I try to keep that in mind, that you can't tell by looking at somebody what kinds of struggles they're facing.
Right.
I mean, before I came out as transgender, most people read me as, a decently middle class, white, cis, straight person. And people know different things about me now, and that changes, the perception. Since then, I've been homeless. I'm currently housing insecure. I'm staying with a friend temporarily, but it's really not easy being in Missouri. I also have chronic pain that makes it really hard for me to work a regular job, which contributes to that.
Right.
But I finally got health insurance recently, and I was able to start estrogen recently. Things are getting better for me. But my point is, everybody's facing difficulty. You never know by looking at somebody if they're struggling with coming out as trans, if they're trying to decide whether they should get an abortion or not, if they just found out that they have cancer or somebody in their family has cancer. If they just found out that they're HIV positive, or you can't know these things by looking at people. And you also shouldn't make assumptions about income and wealth by looking at people, because especially in this country, there's a lot of pressure for people to be conspicuous about how much money they have, as far as having nice cars, nice clothes, nice jewelry, But I think it's also important to remember that there's a huge amount of consumer debt, like credit card debt and college debt, that people aren't really considering. And, in a certain light, like a homeless person with no net worth but no debt might actually have a higher net worth than somebody
Right.
who has an apartment and a job but $200,000 of college debt and credit card debt.
Right,
So
right.
don't make assumptions about people. Understand that everybody's struggling with something and we're all in this together. And that's really what social justice activism is all about, is trying to make things better for everybody by working together.
That sounds, that seems pretty reasonable to me. Like the realization that, hey, like everybody's got their struggles, but some people have different struggles based on characteristics that the world around them kind of almost places on them.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you kind of mentioned that people with different levels of privilege should probably spend more time listening than talking over other groups. One of the criticisms that a lot of people have come out with is this idea that white people are often told to stand at the back and listen versus when they try to express their ideas at something like a Black Lives Matter event. I wonder, do you think that that's the norm, or do you think that's where do you fall on that as a criticism of Black Lives Matter or any organized group, I guess?
Well, I think at a Black Lives Matter event, it's crucial for Black voices to be the most visible.
Right.
I mean, I would even question the wisdom of having white voices included at all. Although I'm not necessarily against it, but again, I see the role of an ally. So we're talking about somebody who doesn't fit into that oppressed group, but wants to help and agrees that they're being mistreated and oppressed and has a privilege that they don't have. So in this case, to use myself as an example, a white person attending or organizing a Black Lives Matter event, it's my role in that as an ally and not a Black person to use my social media platform and my voice to boost
right.
the voices of Black people. It would not be appropriate. It would be outside of my role for me to speak, unless it's in the context of talking to other white people to say, listen to this.
Go listen.
Yeah. And it's, I think it's hard for white people to shut up. I mean, it really is, because we're used to having all of the floor all the time.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons it's so important to do this, to give the floor over, to understand that we shouldn't have it all the time.
Right.
And relinquish that and say, we're going to shut up. We're going to listen. We're going to boost what you're saying through the channels that we have to do that. But this is your thing that you're doing, that you are speaking, and we recognize that, and we don't want to step on you. I have no problem and strongly encourage people to attend in solidarity Black Lives Matter events, no matter what color they are, however they identify. But
right.
But yeah, as an ally and not a Black person, your place, your role is not to speak at those events.
Yeah, we actually, on my regular show, Brainstorm, we just had our bonus content. We spent like an hour talking about this because it seems like people often get caught up in the idea that I don't get to talk, or they don't get to talk, or versus the listening of to marginalized groups,
right? And
it just seems like, well, what was one of the criticisms? The idea that, say, what if there's an idea for a solution that's coming from a person who's told, wait a minute, you're not of this marginalized group, you need to be quiet and listen. And I don't know, to me, it seemed like I actually haven't seen that Not that I've been involved in a lot of these activist events, but and many of the people that I've talked to said that that's something that really doesn't happen very much. If you have a good idea, people will listen to you, and regardless.
Yeah, that's definitely true in my experience, that, when people are trying to come up with solutions to problems, that the source of the solution is not, nobody is bothered by that. But it's, in my experience, though, really what usually happens is that the people who are really most affected by these issues tend to know what the exact problem is and tend to have a much better idea of what really needs to be done to fix it. And often the problem is getting the money to get it done, that getting politicians to take notice and get them to vote certain ways. To get the general public to understand the issue, and just as far as a cultural sea change, to side with them on it. And you kind of need all three of those things as far as, you have to get the public on your side, you have to get politicians on your side, and then you have to spend some money to get it, through the system, to get those kinds of changes to happen. And depending on what your goal is, you might start with one of those, tines versus another. But, I've never heard of an idea being rejected based on it not coming from someone in the oppressed group.
Right.
But generally, again, in my anecdotal experience, the people who are most affected by this have the best ideas about what the issues are and how to fix them.
That seems reasonable to me. Like, yeah, the idea, it seems difficult for a cis white straight dude to really conceive of all the problems that somebody who's not that has in their different experiences. Like I can empathize when somebody tells me their story, but I don't know all their stuff. Like,
right. Right. And that's, again, we were talking about before about, the role of an ally being the signal boost. I think that's the key part of this, is that, a big part of sympathizing is taking that next step as far as acting out on that compassion and trying to help in the way that you can help. Sympathizing is nice, but compassion in action is being an ally, and being an ally means using your resources to help somebody else who needs them more than you do.
Right.
So that's what I encourage people to do, and that's really what social justice activism is.
That's a fair point. Quite often we don't talk about the allocation of resources. We just talk about this issue or that issue, but like you say, like, it takes money to get things done, right? So
yeah, and I mean, it depends on what the goal is, and certain things like running for office, that's going to require money.
Right.
But like other types of things, like if it's something like petitioning to have a law changed or something like that, if you can get politicians on your side with phone calls and things, you can organize that cheaply enough through just social media that doesn't really cost anything. It depends on what your goal is.
Right. That makes sense.
I do want to just mention, though, that a big part of activism is directly supporting activists too. There are a lot of activists out there, just because of the way that our system in this country, as far as our minimum wage laws, and the fact that we don't have a really effective set of anti-discrimination policies that work. As a result, and especially with unpaid internships and with all of just the way that everything ends up, a lot of people who are doing really great activism work can't afford to do it and have to do other things, or just can't afford to keep doing it because they don't have any money. And I know so many brilliant writers and brilliant activists who are delivering pizzas or there's things that they shouldn't be doing, things that they should be writing. Right. I know a number of them who are doing sex work And that's, they should be doing their activism work. And a lot of these people have Patreon accounts. I'm just going to throw this in here. I have one. but yeah, I mean, in the way that in this, they call it the gig economy, you don't actually make enough money from a job these days to pay your bills. And so people end up piecing together multiple jobs,
right.
And doing freelance work and doing all this type of stuff. And activism almost never pays. Like I get paid to do talks sometimes, depending on what the talk is. I mean, if I'm invited to speak at the Lincoln Memorial, I'm not necessarily going to charge for that,
Right.
But if I'm speaking at a university, then yeah, $500 or whatever, that's going to be a significant chunk of change for me. And a university inviting me to speak can afford it differently than, than a rally.
Right.
So, but yeah, I mean, when we're talking about supporting activists, and your role as an ally, for people listening to this, I want you to keep in mind that donating to nonprofits is one way to do that. Another way, though, is to look out for activists whose work you really admire. If you're reading an article on Salon or Bustle or Alternet or The Establishment or whatever, and it says at the bottom, the author's name, and you go to their Twitter and it says that they have a Patreon.
Right.
Maybe throw them $1 or $3 a month, and it makes a really big difference to people.
For sure.
And, it's hardly anything to most people, $1 a month or $3 a month. But like I make less than $500 a month right now for my work. And it's
right.
yeah, I mean, that's just another example of one thing that allies can do, just to put some food for thought out there.
Fair enough. Quite often people don't really understand like the level of work that goes into a lot of things, right? So
yeah,
it would help if people could be compensated for it to some degree, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of we talk about social policies being changed. Is that a product of often the activism in a grassroots level, or is that sometimes through academic means, or do you think that there's a balance that where activists can use academic type data or whatnot to help with that?
I think it depends on what you're talking about. And often in my experience, the social first of all, let me start off by saying that nothing ever changes ever without activists pushing for it. No oppressing systemic force is going to freely give more rights to people that are getting shit on. That's
right.
just, I mean, that's not how that works.
Yeah.
The only rights that are given that weren't there before are rights that are demanded by people.
Right.
And that's how, that's why we have rallies and marches, and that's, why we block highways and things like that, is because, we're fed up and we need change, and then we're not getting it. And I think that's important to start off by mentioning that.
For sure.
But as far as social change versus academic changes versus, political changes, so usually, and again, it depends on what we're talking about, but like I'll use gay rights as an example. Okay. So, gay people for a long time were considered to be mentally ill, and they were treated the way that people with mental illnesses were treated, as far as homosexuality was a crime for a long time. And like Alan Turing is the famous example of this, the British computer scientist.
Right, yeah.
And as punishment, like, legal punishment, sentencing for being accused and found guilty of having gay relations, he was sentenced to be chemically castrated. Yeah. That is, take anti-androgen pills that made him grow breasts and lose his sex drive. And actually, as a trans woman, I'm on the same drugs that he was on.
Was it?
But they will give you gender dysphoria if you are a cis man and you take those drugs, because they change your gender, or they go toward changing your gender. Your your body rather.
Right.
And so he ended up killing himself, and a lot of people think that was probably contributed to it, and I don't doubt that. As far as making these kinds of changes, it took years and really decades and decades of pushes from gay rights activists to get that reclassified from the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual as a mental illness that needed to be diagnosed and treated that way into just something that people are. And academic research certainly helped with that, but it was because of activists arguing back and pushing back against academics and saying, look, you've got it wrong. Right. We are not sick. We are not criminals. We just love each other, and it's none of your freaking business what we want to do in bed with each other. And, and it was pushing, people like Kinsey in the 50s, who wrote Sexual Behavior of the Human Male, and did all of that research, who really opened people's eyes, the public and other academics, about just how commonplace homosexual behavior is in humans. That was very much unknown before, Indiana released all that data.
Right.
And, it was shocking to people, but at the same time, that really opened a lot of people's eyes about this. And so, activists moving, and academics can also be activists. That's not right. But social pushes with academic data behind them, and the more cultural interest in something, the easier it is to get politicians and to push grant funding toward something too. It all kind of feeds in on itself. And then the last thing that happens is the legal changes. Once you have the activists pushing for it and the social acceptance of it, and once you have the data to back it up, in theory. So.
Right. I suppose, what do you think of some of the different anti-fascist groups or Antifa groups that have been activists or have been active in different areas? A lot of the pushback that I've seen have been people who are really upset about the damage to property or punching Nazis or what have you.
So I have an interesting, I suppose I'll say, personal view on this. I am an extremely nonviolent person. I might take it a little too far. Actually, I don't believe in violence in self-defense, which I think a lot of people would draw the line at, like, violence in self-defense is okay, but violence, against other people when it's not in self-defense is not okay.
Right.
I can't imagine hurting another person intentionally, even if it would stop me from being hurt. I don't think I could do it. I've been, just in the course of doing the activism work that I do, I've been threatened many times. I've had a gun, held up to me at a conference where I was speaking. If somebody wanted to shoot me, I'm not going to stop them. Like, I don't want to die. Don't get me wrong.
Right.
But I couldn't attack somebody like that. So it's difficult for me personally, just in my mindset of this, to be complacent, I guess, with people hurting others or destroying property.
Right.
But at the same time, when it comes to activism, I really strongly agree with Malcolm X's stance on this, where he says that nonviolence is great as long as it works. Often, when we're doing activism things, it gets to the point where people are, it's not working. We're not making changes.
Right.
People are dying. People are still, there's still just huge amounts of racism in our criminal justice system. When people are fed up, yes, you can file a petition. You can have a march. There are lots of things you can do that aren't violent. But at the same time, when when nobody is listening to you, when those changes aren't happening and you're out of tools in your toolbox, what do you do?
Right.
And, I don't think blocking traffic is necessarily bad in that case. And people make the argument about emergency vehicles being able to get through.
Right.
That's bullshit. Like, I've been in marches like that, and I'll tell you what happens. We can move out of the way a lot more easily than like bumper to bumper traffic. And we move and they go through. And it's actually faster than cars in rush hour. But yeah, I mean, it's the greater point is that while I don't encourage anyone to be violent or destroy property, if you are out of options and your people are suffering because nothing is being done, I'm not going to condemn you for that.
Okay. I had this discussion the other day actually with I think it was Dan Errol I was talking to. Mm-hmm. And he said that we got to the point where we were talking like it seems like no matter what the protest is, people are saying that it's not okay. So on one level, you've got people saying, well, violence isn't okay. And then so you go to whatever the next level is, blocking highways, and that's not okay. And then you go to just marches, and that's not okay. Right. There's always somebody saying, well, no, we can't do that. No, that's not okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I wear a Black Lives Matter t-shirt or a hoodie every day.
Right.
And I have for quite a while. And, the most common thing I hear about it is from Black people who give me a fist or just they're happy to see it.
Right.
But a lot of times, I get negative comments about it. Not a lot of times, but sometimes. And there are people who don't want me to wear this because that's not the right way, to stand up for Black people, right. To say that Black Lives Matter. And it's really, I can't say Black Lives Matter. What the,
What is the right way to do it?
Right. And I agree with what Dan was saying as far as there's always going to be people, no matter what you do, no matter how congenial you think you're being about your activism, who don't want you to do it. And the reason that they don't want you to do it has nothing to do with what you're doing. It's the fact that you're doing it. Right. They don't want to change the status quo because that means that their privilege is diminished in their mind, that their advantages disappear. When you're used to privilege, equality feels like oppression.
Right.
And I think that's really what's going on is that people they're losing an advantage that they had, and they don't want that to happen. And I can understand that they don't want that to happen, but it's an advantage that they shouldn't have had in the first place. And it's not a bad thing when people who are on the brink of homelessness or are actually homeless, when people who can't afford to feed their kids or feed themselves, when people who can't afford to get an education and toil at jobs that robots could do just as well. It's a waste of human energy and effort. And I mean, I think about all these people, how many Oprah Winfrey's or Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg's or, I mean, all the who are in Liberia, West Africa right now, who are never going to be known to the world,
right? Because
they died when they were 5 years old because they didn't have clean water, right. Or because I mean, it's just it blows my mind how anyone could be against more equality. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting. It's odd to me, the pushback that seems to be coming quite often. I mean, people have all these specific criticisms of these different movements, mm-hmm. and maybe they're valid to some degree about one thing or another. But I often find that they're taking these criticisms and they just say, "Well, so that movement's no good anymore." Okay, so Black Lives Matter is garbage because of X, or feminism is garbage because of X. And I wonder, I find that to be I guess problematic in the least.
Yeah.
At least like it's so fallacious, I think. Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. I mean, like, Black Lives Matter is not as centralized. I mean, it was started by 3 women from St. Louis, actually.
Right.
And well, in this St. Louis area. I mean, it's not a centralized movement in that there are Black Lives Matter independent chapters everywhere. And they're not like, they don't take instructions from some organization.
Right.
I made this, you can't see it, on the podcast, but the shirt that I'm wearing, this Black Lives Matter shirt, I made it. It's not like I bought it from somewhere or some organization gave it to me. I made it.
Right.
Anybody can do that. And I don't speak for Black Lives Matter as an organization. I speak for myself.
Right.
And I support the concept of Black Lives Matter. I support the people who started it as individual activists. And I follow them on Twitter. But
right.
But yeah, I mean, it's a movement. It's not a nonprofit.
Yeah.
So I think that's something important to keep. It might also be a nonprofit. I'm not sure about that, but it's definitely both, or it's definitely also a movement. I mean to say.
Right. Do you think that that's an advantage of it, or for the movement, is that it's not not centralized, or do you think that maybe having a centralized leadership would help it?
I think there are advantages and disadvantages either way. I think that when you have one centralized organization planning all of your media, you can have a centralized message, a centralized mission. You can have organized press releases on certain things. You can pool your resources more easily and like devote certain things to certain types of long-term things that you're planning, but you haven't announced yet. So there are certainly reasons to do it, which is why, like Planned Parenthood, for example, they have their national headquarters in New York City, and then they have all of these offices around the country that are their clinics.
Right.
And, it works for them. But, by doing it out separately with decentralized people who are just contributing to this all on their own, rallying around this concept that Black Lives matter too,
right.
that Black lives, are important. I mean, it's not a concept that I think should alienate anybody unless you're racist. And I think that depending on what each individual group has for their goal, it can work to their advantage or to their disadvantage to be independent like that. I think it really just depends.
Okay. No, fair enough. One of the things that people often criticize about social justice is they think that it focuses too much on people as groups of based on whatever characteristic they happen to have, rather than individuals. And I wonder, what do you think of that particular aspect of things? Do you think that it's too focused on groups, or do you think that it is a good balance?
I think it depends on what we're talking about. And do you have an example of that?
Well, I guess people they often think that people are being judged based on or being placed into categories based on the color of their skin or their gender or what have you, and rather than looking at the kind of people that they are, like or the content of their character. So quite often I've heard the Martin Luther King quote quite a few times, and it's from sources that are anti-social justice. So it seems a little weird, but
right. It would be great if we could live in a world where people are judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin, but that's not the world we live in right now.
Right.
And the point of Black Lives Matter activism and anti-racism activism as a whole is to get us to that world.
Right.
Pretending that we already live in that world or saying like I don't see color is denial of the circumstances that we're in right now, and denial of the need for additional activism to get us from here to there. And as I was saying before, it's pretty easy to understand the motivation for that if you're someone who stands to give up advantages by no longer having a group of people who are systemically oppressed,
right.
And you have advantages that they don't have. But the real truth of it is when everybody is more able to take care of themselves, when people aren't suffering, the whole of society is healthier and better off. I mean, if you wanted to put some numbers to it, I can't remember if it's 55 or 75. It's one of those two numbers. But if you earn less than, I think it was 75. If you earn less than $75,000 a year, as far as the taxes that you pay, and the total benefits you receive back from just being a citizen of this country, as far as how much the country has spent to educate you K through 12, how much the country has spent on grants for you to go to college if you went to college, how much the country has spent prorated, for roads that you travel on and libraries that they built that you can use and police protection that anyway, the point is, if you make less than $75,000 a year, other people have and continue to subsidize you. You don't pay back in
right.
As much as you're receiving in taxes. So, a lot of people who complain, I think, about all these people who are just like, leeching off the system. I think a lot more people are quote unquote leeching off the system than they might realize.
Yeah.
And I think what that really is at its core is really racism. I mean, it's not about socioeconomic status or income. It's about saying that I don't want these immigrants, leeching. What they're really
right.
talking about is they don't want Mexican people and so on.
right.
But yeah, when you have a society where everybody is educated and everybody's able to work at a job that they love and that's actually really productive and, contributes greatly to society, instead of menial, hard labor type work or not to, downplay the importance of people doing labor for their jobs. But I dream of a world where people have the economic freedom to pursue what makes them happy. And I think that it's going to be necessary sooner rather than later to divorce this idea that your ability to feed yourself and clothe yourself and house yourself and provide health care, and stay healthy rather, should be economically linked to your ability to contribute something that's worth money to other people.
Right.
And I think that's going to become a bigger and bigger problem as automation takes over. This isn't just about robots taking jobs. This is happening now. I mean, there are plenty of people now who are unable to feed themselves and clothe themselves and stay healthy and have a roof over their head, because they're not able to contribute enough to the economy in our capitalistic system to do those things. And that's a failure of the system. And I think that can be best addressed, through activism to fix it.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, as far as we were talking about, splitting people into these different categories, you focus your efforts where they're most needed. And by having people specifically address issues that they're most knowledgeable about and issues that are important to their community, in other words, they have passion for those issues,
right.
It's a lot easier to get things done. And it's a lot easier to raise money to fight on specific things if you are raising money from people who care about that issue rather than just, generally speaking, all social issues.
Right.
If you're talking about, somebody who is saying, my health insurance has gone, from $180 a month up to, $900 a month. that issue is very important to them, and they're going to fight it a lot harder if we single out, fixing the Affordable Care Act,
right?
And we categorize that as one thing, and you can apply that same principle to Black Lives Matter or to any other, abortion access or anything.
So I guess that kind of already speaks to like Sam Harris likes to talk about identity politics. Mm-hmm. This idea that people are already divided into different groups, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not that identity politics or the left, quote unquote, the left is actually dividing people. It's that these groups exist, and now we have to address these things.
Right. And I mean, it depends on your culture, and it depends on what kinds of issues you're facing. A lot of people are in groups involuntarily, I should say. It depends on what kind of group we're talking about. If we're talking about, people who really strongly support the Second Amendment, like that's something that you weren't born with, the way that a gay person is born with being gay. But I think that when you're trying to achieve political goals, it's totally fine to work together with people who face similar issues and can speak authentically on those issues because of firsthand experience. I don't see any issue with that.
What do you think of the idea that I guess you kind of talked about economics already, but some of the people that I've talked to who criticize social justice think that all of this is boiled down to economics, and none of it has to do with race, and it's all just capitalism or economics or whatever, what have you. What do you think of that, I guess?
It's nonsense. There's plenty of evidence that, I think I'll just use one example. If you have like a resume that you send out to a job, and it has a white person's name, quote unquote, white person's name, like John or Henry or something, traditionally classic that is very common for white people to name their kids, versus Tyrone or D'Angelo or something more common that Black people will name their sons. There's tons and tons of evidence, tons. Every time they do this study, it's been repeated many times with large sample sizes, that you get way more calls for interviews from the white sounding names than the black sounding names.
Right.
And we're talking about identical resumes, identical grade point averages, identical extracurriculars, identical reference letters. Everything is the same. The only difference is whether it's a quote unquote black name or quote unquote white name. So if we're talking about the ability to get a decent job, that's really strong evidence right there that that's affected by race and not economics. And that's just one example. There are so many more. I was just reading an article about looking at all the different sentences for cannabis possession and I can't say that word. Pipes and things.
Paraphernalia.
Yes, thank you. In the sense that, the sentencing in courts in Florida, in all the different counties in Florida. So this was a huge study that the Herald down there did, and they looked at data over, I think it was a 20-year period. And it was a huge undertaking for them. But basically what they found out was in every single county, when you look at the sentencing for black convicts versus white convicts, the jail time is about double for people who are black versus people who are white. And that's, when you're doing this as a study, and that's when you take into consideration, priors and obviously the amount that they have as far as, if it's a misdemeanor amount or a felony amount. And all of those other factors, when you factor all that out, it's about double.
Wow.
And this is a known issue. Like, this is one of the, like Michelle Alexander wrote about this several, years ago in the new Jim Crow. And like it's a known problem that the criminal justice system is much more harsh on people of color. And like we saw this with, Brock Turner, was it the
right. Yeah.
The suspect who, I think he was actually convicted. So the rapist,
the rapist.
I usually, would just go ahead and say rapist, but I try not to do that until they're convicted.
I think he was convicted.
Yeah. And as I recall, that's right. Because he only served he was sentenced to, I think, 6 months and he served 3.
Yeah, that's right.
And, it's absurd. And, I think that's just nonsense. I think economics is a huge, huge part of it. But I also think that's a major reason that Bernie Sanders lost the primary, is because he spent too much effort focusing on the economic arguments, not enough focusing on the race ones. There's a lot of racism and it's a big issue, and it's Donald Trump was able to tap that from the other side.
Right.
But don't get me wrong. One of my majors in school, I didn't graduate, but one of my majors was econ. And I definitely approach things when I'm thinking about data in economic terms as much as I can. But no, racism exists. I'm sorry, but it does. And it has a huge influence on social justice.
Right. I got a couple questions that I'll kind of wind us up with, or wind us down. I don't know which way you say that. But one of them is, if there was one thing that you needed people to realize about social justice, what would it be?
That's an interesting question. I'd say that if you want to think of yourself as a humanist, that is somebody who believes that human welfare and the meaning of life and health and happiness are achievable through human effort as opposed to supernatural entities granting that to us. And you believe that positive changes in the world come about through human action. I would say that if you want the world to be a better place, that humanism and social justice activism are the same thing. They're inseparable.
Right.
I, as a civil rights activist, as a social justice activist, I do activism because I care about human welfare and the meaning of life and health and happiness, not, just for me, but for everybody. And I believe that humans are responsible for our own lives and welfare, and that positive change comes through us doing action. And I think of doing social justice as just as a foundational, just integral aspect of being a good person and being a humanist and being ethical. And that's what I would want people to take away from that. If you want to call yourself a humanist, if you want to live ethically, I think being a social justice activist goes hand in hand with that.
I like that. When the American Humanist Association started their social justice kind of thing, where they conglomerated a bunch of different humanist organizations, I was very pro that idea. I thought this is a great idea, and I couldn't believe when I saw people pushing back against it. I just couldn't. Of course, this makes sense. Of course, you got to include Black humanists and LGBTQ humanists, and it just makes sense. But
right,
but
makes sense to me.
Yeah. If you had to criticize your own position, what would be something that you would what would be your criticism of your own side?
That's interesting. I think that there are a lot of people who are interested in activism, not a lot, but more than I'm comfortable with. interested in activism for edging on the wrong reasons.
Okay.
It can be trendy in certain circles to be an activist. And it's not like we're getting rich over here. We're really, really not.
No.
Really, really not. But I know that there are some people who really enjoy the limelight, who do this work. And that's fine if it gets people to listen. And I have zero problem with getting people to listen. But I just worry about authenticity and making sure that the people who are speaking on issues are speaking authentically out of passion for that issue and out of experience with that issue and out of a genuine, sincere need to make things better for people. If activism is no longer your passion, then move on and do something else. And if activism isn't your passion in the first place, but you feel guilty, donate some money and do something else.
Right.
It's a lot of work for very little pay and very little recognition for most people who do it. And that's fine. It takes a lot of people working together to accomplish anything. It's okay to take breaks. It's okay to be worn out and, need a break. But if your heart's not in it anymore, it shows. And there are plenty of people ready and willing to move on up to the next tier and bring fresh ideas and fresh passion into it. So I would say just make sure that you're making room for people who have good ideas and good things to say, and make sure your heart is in it.
Fair enough. I've never really considered myself an activist, but I have an interest in making the world a better place to some degree. And, myself, I'm better as a listener. So this is why I'm doing this project rather than some ranting project where I go out and do talks or whatever. But
if we're still rolling, I'd like to address that actually.
You bet.
I think, and when I do talks, I encourage people to think about it this way too, that activism can take so many different forms. It's not, there's the traditional, organizing rallies and chanting and running for office and things like that. But there's it's 2017, a podcast is very much activism the way that I would say it. If you're talking about these issues, if you're reaching out to other activists and, broadcasting this stuff literally and figuratively and, breaking it down and digging in about ways that people can contribute more or why they should, that's activism. That counts very much as activism. I think that counts as much, as writing a book about these issues did 30 or 40 years ago before podcasts were a thing. Right. I see people talking about how they, they're not an activist. All I do is share stuff on social media. And I was like, well, that's not nothing. That's
it counts a little bit. Hey.
Yeah. I don't want to discourage people from doing that because it doesn't count, quote unquote. It does count. It's something. I think that, there's a reasonable level where people could be doing more. But I would never tell somebody that they're being lazy or not doing enough if they're doing what they can. Right. And if what you can do is share stuff on social media because you're a busy person, that's fine. Do that. I'm not going to say no to any help that you can offer the cause.
Fair enough.
Whether it's just sharing stuff or giving me a thumbs up or, donating to an org or whatever it is that you can do.
No, fair point.
Yeah. Step one is calling yourself, identifying as an activist.
Right.
That's what I tell people. Yeah. That once you're seeing through the eyes of an activist, then everything changes and you start to see how you can help all around you. That's
a good way of looking at it. I hadn't really thought of it that way before.
Thanks.
Okay. So I guess we'll wrap it up. Where can people find your stuff?
My website is daniellemuscato.com. If you're interested in having me come speak at your local group or university or conference or anything, I also do debates, and you can get in touch with me on there. I have a bunch of different social media accounts, all the standard ones, Twitter, Instagram, at Danielle Muscato. If you want to follow me on Facebook, I have a page at facebook.com/DanielleMuscato.page. And I also have, as I mentioned earlier, a Patreon account. If you go to patreon.com/Danielle Muscato, I would love to have you as a supporter. Even $1 a month makes a big difference for me.
Yeah.
I also host a podcast called the Resist Podcast, which you can find on iTunes or Stitcher Radio. Just look up Resist Podcast. And then the website for that is resistpodcast.com.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you very much for your time. I really enjoyed our chat.
Yeah, me too. Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Hardcore Skeptic.
Okay, so that was my interview with Danielle Muscato. I think we covered a lot of the same stuff as I have in other interviews, but also some new stuff that was specifically about activism and the way in which we can support activist groups. I didn't consider myself an activist until talking to Danielle, and now I do. Though not necessarily a good one. I really want to thank Danielle for coming on the show and talking to me about this stuff. Hers is a great voice in the atheist and skeptic communities as well as out in the public, and I'm blown away by her positivity and willingness to put herself out in front of these battles. You can find more about Danielle at daniellemuscato.com. That link, along with a bunch of others, will be in the show notes. I also want to thank my patrons, Lito Anor, Podunk Polymath Podcast, the Utah Outcasts, and Larry Wilson. You can go and become a patron at patreon.com/hardcoreskeptic. That will give you access to a patron-only RSS feed where you can hear patron-only exclusives and get early access to episodes. You can also donate to our GoFundMe page and help us get our conference going. That's gofundme.com/shift-2-reason-2018. Or you can buy Brainstorm gear at our new TeePublic store. tpublic.com/stores/brainstorm-podcast-gear. As for anything else, you can email me at mail@brainstormblog.net. You can find more of these episodes at thehardcoreskeptic.com. You can find me on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and just about anywhere else you can find podcasts. Make sure to follow me on Twitter at hardcoreskeptic and like my Facebook page, facebook.com/hardcoreskeptic. Remember to check out my other show, the Brainstorm Podcast, and my partner show with Gumby, or Destin, Positively Skeptical. You can find those at thebrainstormpodcast.com and brainstormblog.net. I want to give a shout out to Dave Roman. I really appreciate him for creating some custom intro music for this show. I really love it, and I hope that it's not insulting for me to butcher it the way I did so that it fits my purposes. I'll play the full piece at the end of this episode and probably at the end of every future episode. So that's it. I want to thank you for listening, and remember, the truth matters.
Hardcore Skeptic.